Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. In Apple news, they're not keeping their promises on privacy. And so we're going to be talking about Macs here, but remember that essentially Apple has this entire marketing presence of how secure they are, how private they are, how safe they are, et cetera, when quite frankly, they're not. And this is one of the big issues that we've seen. In fact, the worst malware I've ever seen on a mobile device, possibly any device ever, was Pegasus, and it essentially hit iPhones exclusively, not Android. Zero-click infection. It was a massive mess, but we're going to be focusing on privacy here. And like I said, we're going to be talking about the Mac operating system, or Mac OS, that which runs your MacBook, if you've got one. And so Michael Burkhardt of 9to5Mac had a really good write-up on this. And quite frankly, this, I think, is a very serious issue because Apple's not living up to this reputation that they've so carefully crafted. And so let's talk about the backdrop of what went on and where we're at with this right now. So shortly after the release of Mac OS's version Big Sur, that was back in 2020, Apple basically had a widespread server outage. Now, that outage affected Mac OS installation, specifically iMac, Apple Pay, and also their notarization service. Now, what this means is that users had major issues opening up apps, and it therefore revealed a flaw in how Apple was actually handling verification on its MacBooks. So, if you didn't know, basically a Mac does a couple of different things and checks when you launch an app or application. Now, one of those checks is to verify that the app isn't malware. Apple's okay at that. And another one is to make sure that the developer certificate associated with the app is still valid. Now, these checks are meant to keep users safe, and they're widely referred to as app notarization. Now, normally, if you're using your Mac offline, the checks just fail and your app opens essentially as usual. It just launches and there you go. But this server outage occurred, and when it happened, basically Mac OS was still attempting to check the servers rather than just failing. And by virtue of that, apps were taking an insane amount of time to launch, if they even did, because they were kept waiting for those checks, instead of just failing off in like airplane mode, for example. So after that incident occurred, Apple announced that it essentially was going to change some of these things, and that included an option to allow users to completely opt out of online notarization checks. And now you know where we're going with this. Those changes were supposed to roll out starting in 2021. And initially, Apple announced these improvements because there were concerns around whether or not the company was actually using this notarization process to collect data on what apps people were using, and quite frankly, they are. So the company reassured everybody that that wasn't the case, and they highlighted some of the changes that they were going to make to essentially ensure that that wasn't going to happen. And I quote the support document from that time. To further protect privacy, we have stopped logging IP addresses associated with developer ID certificate checks, and we will ensure that any collected IP addresses are removed from logs. In addition, over the next year, we will introduce several changes to our security checks. A new encrypted protocol for developer ID certificate revocation checks, strong protections against server failure, a new preference for users to opt out of these security protections, end quote. Now, you'll also note that they didn't talk about fingerprinting, and I've talked about that extensively. Fingerprinting could be basically data on your app configuration versus your battery life versus all other kinds of checks that essentially could be reverse engineered and make you and your device identifiable again. It's not just IP addresses, but that's what they're talking about here, right? So, to Apple's credit, for the record, back then, they did implement some of those changes that they processed. They did stop collecting IP addresses, according to them. They also did create a new encrypted protocol for developer ID certificate checks. However, they still haven't really addressed when you, the Mac user, can completely opt out of the online notarization check. Now, on top of this, all references on that support document regarding that were removed from the document sometime within the past year, according to 9to5Mac. It would also appear that Apple has scrapped its plans on allowing users to launch apps without any form of online security checks before opening, which is honestly kind of a shame. That's what they said too, 9to5Mac. And so obviously allowing users to opt out of notarization checks would be a huge privacy win. That fingerprinting would be much harder to do. And by virtue of that, there has also been essentially this concept, not every Mac owner believes this, that you don't actually own the Mac, especially because you can't make it fully private. Like, we have the ability, let's say on traditional hardware, to blow away the operating system, install, Linux, basically get off the grid with this, and ensure that we can install essentially things that will block the big boys of the world from looking at us, to be private as well. It takes work, but you can do it. But Mac is a closed ecosystem. Apple in general is a closed ecosystem. And by virtue of that, it would be very hard to get out of that ecosystem. You can't just blow away the operating system and install something else. And even if you're using things like Boot Camp, you're still running Mac hardware on Mac ID. So this is, I think, a big issue. And if basically Apple continues to data mine, they are kind of flying in the face of everything. They put up a billboard before the pandemic that said, what goes on in your iPhone stays on your iPhone. I did a whole video and podcast and even an article on that one about what a joke that was. But also understand that they are tracking you, and they shouldn't be able to track you in that way. In the same way Microsoft shouldn't be either, right? And as Microsoft continues to integrate Microsoft products with the cloud, et cetera, they've got a good understanding and idea and possibly access to data, depending on their privacy controls as well. Although I'm less concerned about, paying for Microsoft than I would be a free one like Google. Nevertheless, these are things that we have to consider. And so understand, Mac people, you're not 100% private. And while under the guise of keeping you safe, which quite frankly you can do yourself and way more effectively than Apple can, believe me, there are a lot better threat detection systems out there than what Apple has. This is where we're at. And so understand, Apple is tracking you. They're not living up to their privacy promises. And here we are. So best of luck to us all, especially you Apple fans. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please attempt to stay private. Thanks, everybody.